Somewhere in Japan in the late 1990s, a Toyota pulled up to a starting line. It did not look like much. It had a back seat, a warranty, air conditioning, and a price tag an ordinary person could actually afford. In the next lane sat a Ferrari. It cost 10 times as much, and every single part of it was built to win. Then the light went green and the Ferrari lost. Scenes like that turned one engine into a myth. And here is the part almost nobody understood at the time. The man who designed that engine was never trying to beat Ferrari at all. He was trying to build something that would simply never break. He hid its real power on purpose. And by the time the world worked out what he had actually created, it was already far too late to put it back in the box. This is the story of the 2JZ. It is the engine Toyota underrated on purpose. It is the engine tuners turned into a legend. And it is the engine that still humiliates cars costing 10 times as much more than 30 years after it was born. To understand how one ordinary inline-six became the most worshipped engine on the planet, you have to go back to a strange and golden moment in Japan. It was a time when the fastest cars in the country were all forced to lie about how fast they really were. Toyota followed that rule in public. But in private, Toyota broke it in a way that nobody fully noticed for years. Stay with me because the quiet trick they pulled is the whole reason this engine became immortal. In the early 1990s, Japan was at the absolute peak of an economic boom, and its car makers were at war. Not a war over price or over comfort, but over speed. Every manufacturer wanted to build the fastest, most advanced machine on the street, and money was almost no object. Engineers were handed budgets that would be unthinkable today. They were told to build the best and the cost would be sorted out later. It was a rare and golden moment, the kind that produces legends precisely because nobody is counting every coin. And Toyota intended to spend that moment wisely. Nissan had the Skyline GTR, a technological monster with all-wheel drive and twin turbos that was busy destroying everything it touched on the racetrack. Mazda had the rotary-powered RX-7, light and razor-sharp. Honda had just stunned the world with the NSX, a mid-engine supercar it claimed an ordinary person could drive every day. And in the middle of all of it, Toyota wanted a flagship of its own. The numbers these companies quoted kept climbing year after year, and the cars kept getting faster. The Skyline had become so dominant in motorsport that the press had started calling it Godzilla, a monster that could not be stopped. That was the bar Toyota wanted to clear. So when the engineers sat down to design the engine for the new Supra, they were not just building a motor. They were building a statement about what Toyota could do when it finally stopped holding back. Then the industry got nervous. The cars were becoming too powerful for public roads, the accident figures were climbing, and the government was paying close attention. So rather than wait to be regulated, the car makers made a quiet deal among themselves. They agreed that no new car sold in Japan would officially be advertised with more than 276 horsepower. It was a form of self-restraint, and the world came to know it as the gentleman's agreement. On paper, it worked beautifully. For more than a decade, almost every serious Japanese performance car carried the exact same figure: 276 horsepower. The Skyline said 276. The RX-7 said 276. The Supra would say 276. It became the most obvious open secret in the entire car world, because everybody knew these engines were making more than that. The manufacturers simply were not allowed to admit it, so they all quietly agreed to print the same polite lie. This is the world the 2JZ was about to be born into. Toyota was building a new Grand Tourer, a long sleek coupe called the Supra, and it needed an engine worthy of carrying the badge into the next decade. Now, most engineers handed that job would have done the obvious thing. They would have chased the biggest number they could safely sign off on. Toyota did the opposite. The team behind this engine made a decision that sounded almost backwards at the time. They decided not to chase peak power at all. They decided to chase strength, and they were willing to be misunderstood for years to get it. To see how strange that decision was, you have to understand what every other engineer was chasing. The great obsession of the 1990s was lightness. Aluminium blocks, thinner castings, less weight everywhere. A lighter engine helps a car stop and turn and accelerate, so the entire industry was in a race to shave away every gram it could. Toyota had already taken a first step toward its masterpiece with an engine called the 1JZ, a smaller 2.5-liter 6 that proved the basic design. But for the new Supra, they scaled the idea up into the engine that would become a legend. They called it the 2JZ, and at the heart of it they made a choice that looked almost stubborn. They built the block out of cast iron. It was heavier than aluminium. It was old-fashioned. And it was completely deliberate. Iron does not flex and distort under extreme pressure the way aluminium can. When you force huge amounts of boost into an engine, the block has to hold every moving part in near perfect alignment, or the whole thing slowly tears itself apart. Toyota wanted a foundation that would simply refuse to move, no matter what was thrown at it. Then they went further. They used what engineers call a closed-deck design. In simple terms, the top of the engine block is left almost completely solid around each cylinder, instead of the open gaps most engines use. It is one of the strongest possible ways to build the core of an engine, and also one of the most expensive and the hardest to push past its limits. Most car makers would never put a closed-deck iron block in a road car, because for normal driving it is wild overkill. Toyota built its road car around exactly that. The engine that came out of all this was the 2JZ GT. 3 liters. 6 cylinders sitting in one long straight line, which is naturally smooth and beautifully balanced. A forged crankshaft spinning on 7 sturdy main bearings. Connecting rods and a bottom end built more like something from a commercial truck than a sports car. And bolted to it, a pair of turbochargers arranged in sequence. That sequential turbo setup was clever in its own right. At low engine speed, only the first turbocharger does the work, so the engine responds quickly and there is almost no lag. Then, as the revs climb, the second turbo is brought online to deliver a hard, sustained surge of power right to the top. To the driver it felt seamless, like one endless wave of acceleration, and it quietly hid just how much was really going on underneath. There was a quiet genius in choosing 6 cylinders in a straight line as well. That layout is naturally balanced, so it runs smooth and stays calm even when it is working extremely hard. A straight 6 also makes the block long and rigid, and that rigidity is yet another reason the 2JZ could shrug off pressure that would twist a lesser engine into scrap. Every single choice fed the same goal: strength and then more strength. And the official power figure for all of this engineering was 276 horsepower, the number everyone had agreed to print. Here is where the lie becomes almost funny. When Toyota sold the very same turbocharged engine in the United States, where the gentleman's agreement did not exist, they rated it at 320 horsepower. Same engine. Same turbos. One number in Japan, a much bigger number across the ocean, simply because in one country they were allowed to tell the truth and in the other they were not. But the horsepower figure was never really the secret that mattered. The real secret was the ceiling. The engineers who designed this block knew it could handle far, far more than the modest figure on the brochure. They had quietly built a 276 horsepower engine on a foundation strong enough for 2 or 3 times that. And they did something almost unheard of. They knew and they said nothing. They simply set it loose inside an ordinary Toyota and waited to see who out in the world would be brave enough or curious enough to find out what it could really do. There is one more detail that tells you everything about how seriously Toyota took this car. That heavy iron engine added weight, and weight was the enemy. So to balance it out, Toyota became obsessed with shaving grams from everywhere else on the Supra. They used hollow fibers in the carpet. They fitted a magnesium steering wheel, a plastic fuel tank, a hollow rear spoiler filled with gas, and aluminium for the hood and other panels. An entire team fighting over individual grams, all so they could afford to keep the one heavy thing that truly mattered: the unbreakable block. It did not take long for someone to start digging. Tuners in Japan got hold of the 2JZ first, and then the cars began arriving in America and Europe, and a whole new generation got their hands on it. They turned up the boost. They expected the engine to do what tuned engines almost always do, which is make more power for a while and then let go in a cloud of smoke and broken metal. It did not let go. They pushed past 400 horsepower on the standard factory internals, and the engine simply held. They pushed past 600 and it held. They went past 800 horsepower on the same block, the same forged crank, and the same rods that rolled off the production line, and the 2JZ just kept taking it and asking for more. Soon builders were talking about 4 figures. 1,000 horsepower and beyond from an engine that had been sold to the public as a humble 276 horsepower Grand Tourer. The foundation Toyota had buried was finally being dug up, and it turned out to be even deeper than anyone had dared to guess. What stunned people most was not just the power. It was that the engines kept doing it for years. Builders would punish a 2JZ on a dyno, run it hard at the strip, then drive it home and do it all again the next weekend. Mechanics started telling the same story to anyone who would listen. You could throw almost anything at this engine and it would just keep showing up for work. This is the exact moment the legend was made. Suddenly a used Supra was not just a quick Toyota. It was a blank check. For the price of a wealthy man's annual service bill, an ordinary enthusiast could build a car that would pull up alongside a Ferrari or a Lamborghini and then calmly drive away from it. The exotic car makers had spent decades selling one idea above all others: the idea of exclusivity. They sold the belief that this kind of speed was reserved for the few. And then, almost by accident, A Toyota engine handed that same speed to absolutely everyone. The tuning houses of Japan turned it into an art form. Famous shops took the 2JZ and the Supra to places that seemed impossible, building cars that chased 200 miles an hour, some of them tearing down public highways in the dead of night and becoming legends in their own right. The engine became so trusted and so endlessly strong that people stopped keeping it in Supras at all. They began dropping the 2JZ into anything that would hold it. Old drift cars, muscle cars, tiny hatchbacks, even machines from rival brands. If you wanted huge, reliable power, there was one answer, and it had become a kind of inside joke among gearheads. Just 2JZ, swap it. And the reason it could take all of this was not luck. It was that backwards decision made years earlier in a quiet engineering office. The closed deck, the iron block, the forged crank, the overbuilt bottom end. All of that hidden strength, paid for by the customer without ever knowing it, was now being cashed in by tuners who could hardly believe their luck. Then the 2JZ stepped off the racetrack and into the culture itself. The Supra became a movie star, painted a bright orange and parked at the center of one of the biggest car films ever made, seen by millions of people who had never thought twice about an engine in their lives. Overnight, a generation that had never held a wrench learned the shape of that car and the sound of that engine, and they fell in love with what it stood for. Because the 2JZ stood for something that is rare and genuinely beautiful. It stood for the underdog. It stood for the idea that the little guy, armed with the right tool and a bit of nerve, could humble the giants who thought their place at the top was guaranteed forever. That story does not fade with time, and so the legend only grew. It spread into everything. Drift events on the far side of the world ran on it. Video games put it in the hands of millions more, who learned to love the engine before they were even old enough to drive. It crossed every border and every language because the thing it represented needed no translation. Give an ordinary person the right engine, and they can stand toe-to-toe with the very best in the world. And then something happened that proved just how deep that legend ran. The cars themselves began to climb in value sharply year after year. A clean original Super Turbo, a car that had once been a sensible and attainable coupe, slowly turned into a treasure that collectors would fight over. The most famous example of all, the orange car from the film, eventually sold at auction for a sum well into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. People were not just paying for a car anymore. They were paying for a piece of the legend, and for an engine that had earned every bit of its reputation the hard way. Which brings us to the obvious question. Cars have moved on. Modern engines make staggering power straight from the factory, more than the wildest dreamers of the 1990s would have believed. So why are people still chasing a 30-year-old Toyota engine and paying more for it every single year? The answer is in how engines are built today. A modern engine is a sealed box. It is wrapped in software, in emissions hardware, in incredibly tight tolerances and delicate components, and it fights you the moment you try to change anything. It is brilliant, but it is fragile in the ways that matter to a tuner, and it was never designed to be opened up and pushed far beyond its limits. The 2JZ came from a simpler and more honest time. It was overbuilt, it was forgiving, and it welcomed everything you dared to throw at it. You did not need a factory or a supercomputer to unlock it. You needed a wrench, a plan, and a little courage. And the world that built the 2JZ is gone. Tightening emissions rules pushed car makers towards smaller, more complex engines, squeezed for efficiency and locked down tight. The freedom to build something heavy, simple, and absurdly overbuilt just because it would last forever mostly disappeared along with that era. The 2JZ was the product of a brief window in history, and when that window closed, it took the recipe with it. There is a final twist that says it all. When Toyota finally brought the Supra name back years later, they did not build a new 2JZ to go with it. Instead, they partnered with another company and used an engine borrowed from someone else. The new car was fast and capable and genuinely good. And yet, all over the world, the first thing a huge number of fans said was the same thing. It is not a real Supra until you put a 2JZ in it. An entire community, decades on, still measuring every successor against one engine from the 1990s. That is not nostalgia. That is a legend that simply refuses to die. So that is the story of the 2JZ. Toyota underrated it. The tuners unlocked it. And Ferrari, along with every other name that sold speed as a luxury for the few, never saw it coming. One quiet decision to build for strength instead of for bragging rights created something that outlived the rules it was born under, outlived its own golden era, and outlived almost every rival it ever lined up against. The engineers who made that call did not build the most powerful engine of their time. They built the most willing one. They put strength first, told no one the full truth, and let the rest of the world spend the next 30 years discovering exactly what they had done. They genuinely do not make them like that anymore, and deep down, Everyone who loves these machines knows it. If you want to know which engine the Germans themselves were genuinely afraid of next, that story is even stranger than this one, and it is waiting for you right here. Subscribe to Overrun and we will keep digging up the legends, the underdogs, and the builds the big names quietly hoped you would forget.